The boy almost didn't stop. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward, how close it came to nothing. How Owen Bradshaw, 11 years old, muddy boots and a backpack held together by a single working zipper, almost just kept walking past the old drainage ditch behind Lakeview Cemetery on that gray Tuesday in November. He'd been cutting through the cemetery the same way he always did after school, because the streets around it added 7 minutes to the walk home, and 7 minutes mattered when the temperature was sitting at -8, and his jacket had a broken snap at the collar. He knew every shortcut in the Riverside neighborhood, every gap in every fence. When you didn't have bus fare most days, you learned. The sound he heard wasn't loud. That was the strange part. It wasn't banging or screaming. It was more like a low, rhythmic knock, patient almost, coming from somewhere beneath the cedar hedge that ran along the cemetery's south wall. A sound that didn't belong to wind or branches or any animal Owen could name. He stopped. Later, when people asked him why he didn't just walk away, Owen wouldn't have a good answer. He was 11. He was cold. He had homework he hadn't started, and a grandmother who worried when he was late. Every reasonable thing in him said to keep moving. But he crouched down instead, pushed aside a curtain of dead branches, and found the storm drainage access panel, a rectangular steel door set into the concrete base of the wall, vibrating faintly with each knock from the other side. Owen sat back on his heels in the frost-stiff grass and stared at it. "Hello?" he said. The knocking stopped. Then a voice, muffled and rough, like someone speaking through layers of cloth. "Is someone there? Please, please, is someone there?" Owen's heart did something complicated in his chest. He reached out and pulled on the panel's handle. It was padlocked. He pulled again anyway, uselessly, then pressed his face close to the seam. "I can hear you," he said. "I can't open it. It's locked." A long breath from the other side. Okay. Okay, son, listen to me very carefully. My name is Richard Calloway. I need you to call 911. Can you do that?" Owen had an old Samsung his grandmother had bought second-hand for emergencies. He dialed with shaking fingers, and when the dispatcher answered, he said very clearly, "There's a man locked inside the storm drain behind Lakeview Cemetery on Garrison Road. He's alive. His name is Richard Calloway." He stayed until the police came. 19 minutes. He crouched in the frozen grass the whole time, one hand pressed flat against the steel door, talking to the man on the other side about nothing in particular. School, the Leafs season, whether the Tim Hortons on Dundas would be busy this time of day. Because something told him the man needed to hear a voice more than he needed silence. He didn't know then what he'd found. He didn't know that Richard Calloway's photograph had been on the front page of the Hamilton Spectator for 6 days running. He didn't know that Richard's company, Calloway Consolidated, employed nearly 400 people in 3 provinces, or that the man's disappearance had triggered from Ontario to British Columbia, stretching from to British Columbia. He didn't know any of that. He just knew that someone was scared and alone in the dark, and that he was the one who had found them. Dorothy Bradshaw was 63 years old and moved like she was 50, except on the mornings when her hip reminded her she was actually closer to 70. She worked the early shift at the community center laundry facility on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on the other days she watched 2 neighborhood children before school and kept Owen's life running on a rail she'd built herself out of sheer determination and a very detailed weekly planner. She had raised Owen since he was 4 years old. His mother, her daughter Claire, had left one April morning and sent a single text message from somewhere in Alberta that Dorothy had read twice, and then put her phone face down on the kitchen counter and not touched for the rest of the day. There was no father to speak of, not one who'd ever made himself known. Anyway, Dorothy didn't tell Owen his mother had abandoned them. She told him his mother was unwell, that she needed time to get better, and that while she was getting better, they would take care of each other. It was the most honest version of the truth she could offer a 4-year-old, and she'd stuck to it for 7 years because she didn't know what else to do. The house on Fenwick Street was a narrow 2-story, with a radiator that ticked through the night and a kitchen window that let in a cold draft she'd stuffed with a folded dish towel in October and left there every year until March. The upstairs bathroom had a perpetually slow drain. The porch steps needed repainting. Dorothy had a list of things that needed doing, organized by urgency, and she consulted it the way other people consulted horoscopes, regularly and with measured hope. They managed. That was the word Dorothy used when neighbors asked how she was doing. Managing, not thriving, not struggling, managing, which was its own kind of quiet dignity. When Owen came home the evening he found Richard Calloway. He was an hour late and accompanied by a uniformed police officer who had offered him a ride because the boy's lips were turning blue. Dorothy stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and a look on her face that moved from fear to relief to something steely and maternal in the span of about 4 seconds. "He's fine," the officer said quickly. "He actually did something pretty remarkable today." Dorothy looked at Owen. Owen looked at his boots. "I found a guy," he said. "Richard Calloway spent 4 days in Hamilton General before they let him go home, and even then, home was only the Sheraton downtown because the doctors wanted him within 30 minutes of the hospital. He had 2 broken ribs, significant dehydration, a concussion, and a collection of bruises across his torso that the investigators photographed carefully and didn't describe to the press. He was 61 years old. He had gray at his temples and a jaw that newspapers always described as distinguished, which was what they said about men his age who looked like they made decisions for a living. He had built Calloway Consolidated from a small civil engineering firm into one of the larger infrastructure contractors in central Canada. He had done this, largely, alone, not because he was particularly ruthless but because he was meticulous, and because he worked a schedule that made most people flinch. He had been married once. Her name was Susan. She had died 7 years ago, quietly and too quickly of pancreatic cancer, and Richard had responded by working even harder, which was the only language he knew, fluently enough to speak, when the alternative was silence. They had had a son. His name was James. He was 32 now, lived in Vancouver, worked in real estate development, and called on his father's birthday and at Christmas. The calls lasted 20 minutes and covered weather and news and nothing that mattered. Richard was aware, in the way a person can be aware of something they've decided not to examine, that this relationship was less a relationship than a ceasefire. He had made mistakes. He knew that. He had missed school plays and hockey games and a graduation dinner because a bid was due, because a contract was in jeopardy, because the company needed him, and his son, at the time, hadn't seemed to need much of anything except a father who showed up, which was the one thing Richard had reliably failed to provide. These were the thoughts that moved through his mind in the Sheraton room, in the specific quality of silence that hospitals and hotels share, while the winter light came through the window at a low angle. And he tried to reconstruct the days he'd lost. The police had told him his assistant, Gary Fenn, had orchestrated the kidnapping, a business dispute compounded by debt and grievance that had apparently been building for 3 years without Richard having any idea. Gary was in custody. The investigation was ongoing. Richard sat with all of it and found, to his own surprise, that the thing he kept returning to was not Gary, not the dark hours in the drainage pipe, not even the fear, but the sound of a child's voice through 2 inches of steel, talking about the Toronto Maple Leafs in the steady, matter-of-fact way of someone who had decided, without being asked, that another person shouldn't be alone. He asked the detective on the case for the boy's name. Owen was in math class when the secretary knocked on the classroom door and said he was wanted in the office. His teacher, Mr. Sinha, gave him a look that communicated, "What did you do?" And Owen shrugged back, "I genuinely don't know," which was true. In the office, there was a woman in a very good coat who introduced herself as Patricia Hearn and said she worked for Richard Calloway and that Mr. Calloway would very much like to meet Owen and his family if that was agreeable, and that he understood if they preferred otherwise. Owen said he'd have to ask his grandmother. Dorothy said yes, after a pause long enough to make Patricia Hearn reconsider whether the answer might be no. "Sunday," Dorothy said. "He can come here or we can go somewhere public, somewhere with other people around." She said it pleasantly, but in a tone that indicated it was not a suggestion. They met at a diner on Barton Street that Dorothy had chosen because she'd been going there for 20 years and the owner, a Ukrainian woman named Helen, knew her by name and would call police without being asked if anything seemed off. Dorothy was not a suspicious woman by nature, but she had raised a child alone for 7 years on a careful person's income, and careful people did not stop being careful just because someone had a nice coat and a polite assistant. Richard Calloway came in a regular car, not a town car. He was taller than Owen had expected, He'd imagined someone who'd been through what Richard had been through would look somehow reduced. Instead, he looked like a man who'd been cracked open and then carefully, imperfectly reassembled, and was still figuring out what that meant. He sat down across from Owen and Dorothy and ordered coffee, and then looked at Owen for a long moment without saying anything. "I understand you talked to me about hockey," Richard said finally. Owen shrugged. The way 11-year-olds shrug when they're hiding the fact that something matters to them. "You needed something to focus on. How did you know that?" "My gran tells me that. When I'm scared, she makes me talk about something else so my brain has somewhere to go." Richard looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked back at him with the particular expression of a woman who had heard a great many things said about her in her life and was withholding judgment on this one. "You raised a good kid," Richard said. "I know," Dorothy said. Not warmly, not coldly, just as a statement of fact, which Richard found, oddly, more affecting than any compliment would have been. They had coffee. Then they had pie, because Helen came over and said the blueberry was fresh, and Dorothy said yes before Richard could offer to pay, because she wanted to establish early that she wasn't there for what he could provide. Owen watched the two adults across from each other and thought, privately, that they were more similar than either of them knew. Both of them had a quality he recognized but couldn't have named, a kind of bracedness, like people who had been hurt by something large and had rearranged themselves around the shape of it. His gran had rearranged herself around his mother leaving. He didn't know what Richard Calloway had rearranged himself around, but he could see the seams. Before they left, Richard asked if it would be all right to stay in touch. Dorothy considered this longer than was comfortable. "Owen can make that decision himself," she said. Richard looked at Owen. "Sure," Owen said. The first few weeks were careful and a little formal. Richard's assistant sent a thank-you gift, a good winter coat and a gift card to the bookstore on King Street, which Dorothy accepted and did not feel conflicted about because Owen's current coat was inadequate and books were always appropriate. She wrote a thank-you note in her neat looping handwriting and made Owen sign it. Richard texted Owen directly, with Dorothy's permission, short messages that were clearly composed by someone not entirely fluent in texting. "Hope school is going well. Maple Leafs pulled out a win last night." Owen responded in kind. The exchanges were brief and slightly awkward, and both of them kept showing up for them. In January, Richard asked Dorothy if he could take Owen to a Leafs game in Toronto. Dorothy said she'd have to think about it. She thought about it for a week, consulted with Helen at the diner, and with her friend Maureen from the community center, and then said yes, but that she'd be driving them, and she'd be in the building, and if Owen wanted to leave at any point, they'd leave. Richard said that seemed completely reasonable. They drove to Toronto on a Saturday. The game was good. The Leafs actually won, which Owen considered a statistical near miracle. And Richard bought them both hot chocolate and spent most of the second period explaining the salary cap situation in a way that suggested he'd done research specifically so he could hold up his end of a conversation with an 11-year-old. Dorothy sat 3 rows back. She told herself she was just being careful, but somewhere in the third period, watching her grandson lean forward in his seat, animated in a way she hadn't seen in some time, she felt something loosen in her chest. A knot she'd been holding for years, the particular tension of trying to be enough for someone when you secretly feared you might be coming up short. She hadn't been able to give Owen a father. She hadn't been able to give him much at all, really, beyond her time and her steadiness, and the fierce, unshowy constancy of a woman who showed up every day regardless. She had tried very hard not to feel the weight of what she couldn't provide. She let herself cry a little, quietly, during the commercial break. Helen later told her that was exactly what she should have done. In February, Richard drove to Hamilton on a Wednesday for no particular reason and knocked on the door of the house on Fenwick Street and asked Dorothy if she wanted help with the porch steps. Dorothy stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment. "You own a construction company," she said. "I do, and you want to fix my porch steps." "I brought wood," he said, gesturing toward his car. "And a sander. I'm reasonably competent. I built a deck once. In 2003. It's still standing." Dorothy stepped aside. "I'll put the kettle on," she said. He worked on the steps for 4 hours. Owen appeared at 2 o'clock, home from school, and stood on the walkway staring at the spectacle of Richard Calloway in old jeans and a work coat, sanding the second step with focused attention. "Shouldn't your company do this?" Owen said. "Probably," Richard said, without looking up, "but this seemed like something to do myself." Owen set his backpack down and held the wood steady while Richard drove in the screws, and they worked that way until the steps were done, passing tools back and forth in the early February cold while Dorothy watched through the kitchen window, and the radiator ticked inside, and the sky turned pink over the Fenwick Street rooftops. It happened in March. Owen was at the table doing homework when he found the old newspaper. It had been lining the bottom of the recycling bin, and he'd pulled it out without thinking, looking for scrap paper to work out a math problem, and there it was, a feature article from the Hamilton Spectator dated 7 years ago. He almost put it aside. Then he saw the photograph. It was a family portrait, a man, a woman, a small boy. The caption read, "Richard Calloway, his wife Susan, and their son at the Calloway Foundation Gala, 2017. Owen looked at the small boy in the photograph for a very long time. He had a particular scar at his hairline, a thin pale crescent just above his right ear. Owen had always been told he'd gotten it when he fell off a playground structure at daycare. He'd always accepted this because it was the story he was given, and 4-year-olds accept the stories they're given. But there was a boy in a newspaper photograph from 2017, and that boy had a scar in exactly the same place. Owen pushed the paper away. Then he pulled it back. He looked at the date. He did arithmetic in his head that made his pencil slide out of his fingers onto the table. He was 11. He'd come to live with Dorothy when he was 4. 4 from 11. 7 years ago. He thought about his mother. He thought about the text message Dorothy had received that she'd always been so careful about, the one she'd never read to him, the one she'd put her phone down and gone very quiet about. He thought about the scar. He sat there for a long time, until Dorothy came in from the back garden with a handful of early crocuses and found him sitting with the newspaper and the pencil on the table and a look on his face she'd never seen before. She saw what he'd been looking at. She sat down. She said, "Owen," he said, "Gran." Neither of them said anything else for almost a full minute. Then Dorothy reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, her hand that was dry and warm and had tucked him in 7,000 times, and made his lunches and signed his permission slips, and held him when he cried about his mother, without ever once crying herself in front of him. And she said, very quietly, "I don't know, I truly don't know. But I think we have to find out." He turned his hand over and held hers. The DNA test took 11 days. Richard had agreed within 24 hours of Dorothy calling him, his voice on the phone doing something she couldn't quite categorize. Not excitement, not hope exactly. More like a man very carefully not letting himself feel something until he knew it was real. Those 11 days were the strangest of Dorothy's life. She went to work. She made lunches. She watched Owen move through the house with a peculiar quiet that was different from his usual quiet. He was processing something too large for his 11 years, and she could see it in the way he moved. He didn't talk about it much. Once he asked her, "If it's true, will I have to go somewhere else?" Dorothy said, "No, you are mine and I am yours, and nothing changes that. Whatever is true, that's true first." He nodded and went back to his homework. She went upstairs and pressed her face into a towel and cried for a while, because she was allowed to do that when he couldn't see. Richard sat in his apartment in downtown Hamilton. The morning the results were due. He'd moved from the Sheraton to a furnished rental, though he hadn't entirely articulated to himself why he was still in Hamilton, and tried to read a contract and failed, and eventually just stood at the window watching the Niagara Escarpment in the pale March light. He thought about James. He thought about the distance between them that had grown so gradually he hadn't noticed it becoming permanent. He thought about Susan, and the way she'd always said, "You'll figure it out, Richard. You just have to stop rushing past it." He had always been rushing past something. He thought about Owen Bradshaw, who had crouched in frozen grass for 19 minutes and talked about hockey because he understood, at 11 years old, that what a frightened person needed was a voice. The phone rang. He answered it before it rang twice. Patricia Hearn drove, because Richard's hands weren't quite steady. He sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at Hamilton, going past. The old steel town streets and the Lake Ontario shoreline, and the February to March shift of a Canadian city starting, tentatively, to believe in spring again. Dorothy had asked to meet at the diner. Helen had been told there might be some emotion, and had put the reserved sign on their usual table and laid out a box of tissues at the end of the counter with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had seen a great deal in 40 years of running a diner on Barton Street. Owen was already there when Richard arrived. He was sitting beside Dorothy, with his hands around a hot chocolate, and he looked up when Richard came in, and there was a moment, a held breath that seemed to involve everyone in the restaurant, and Richard looked at the boy, really looked at him, at the set of his jaw that had been Susan's jaw and the scar at his hairline that Richard had watched the emergency room close up, with 2 careful stitches when the boy was 2 years old, and had pulled a decorative ladder off a wall in their front hallway. His name, before Claire Bradshaw had taken him and vanished into a grief Richard had never fully understood, and a resentment he'd never been allowed to address, had been Daniel James Calloway. He'd been 4 years old. Richard had spent 7 years looking, and then, 2 years ago, had stopped looking because the detective agency said the trail was cold and grief eventually demands a resting place. He sat down across from the boy, from Daniel, from Owen, from whoever this child had the right to be, and he couldn't speak for a moment, which was deeply unlike him. "I know," Owen said. Richard nodded, pressed his mouth together, nodded again. "Dorothy showed me the picture. Of when I was little." He paused. "I remembered the hallway, the ladder thing. I always thought I'd made that up." Richard's throat worked. "You didn't make it up," he said. Owen looked at his hot chocolate. I don't want you to think I'm replacing anything." He glanced at Dorothy. "Gran is my Gran. That's not changing." Dorothy made a sound that she immediately converted into a cough. "Of course not," Richard said. "She's your grandmother. She raised you. That's not something that—" He stopped, started again. "That's not something anyone could replace or would want to." He looked at Dorothy across the table, and Dorothy looked back at him, and something passed between them that had no clean name. Not quite gratitude, not quite understanding, not quite grief, but something made of all three. "I missed 7 years," Richard said, to Dorothy, this time. "I know," she said. "Thank you." 4. He stopped again. He wasn't a man accustomed to the limits of language. "For all of it." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table, past her grandson, and put her hand briefly over Richard's. "He's a good boy," she said. "He was a good boy before you knew he was yours." The days that followed were not simple. Nothing about a 7-year gap closes cleanly, and no one involved in Owen's life pretended otherwise. There were lawyers and social workers and conversations in formal offices with chairs that were designed to be neutral and achieved, instead, a specific kind of discomfort. There were phone calls with James Calloway in Vancouver, who was quiet and careful in ways Richard recognized as his own habits returned, and who eventually flew to Hamilton and sat across from Owen at the diner and said, with obvious effort, "I think I'm your brother. I don't really know what to do with that yet. But I wanted to say it." Owen said, "That's okay. I don't know what to do with it either." James almost smiled. Fair, there were hard conversations about Claire, about what she had done, about why. The why was something no one had clean access to, but the picture that emerged over weeks was of a young woman who had been struggling with something she hadn't told anyone and had made a decision in a desperate moment that she could not have understood the full weight of. Richard had loved her briefly, years ago. He had not been kind enough about it when it ended. These were not excuses, they were just the ragged truth, which is what truths usually are when you look at them long enough. Owen processed all of it with the specific dignity of a child who has learned early that some things don't resolve into easy feelings, and who has also learned, from a woman who showed up every day without fanfare, that showing up is itself the answer to most questions. He did not stop being Owen Bradshaw. He also became, carefully and in his own time, Daniel Calloway, or perhaps someone who held both names the way a place can hold 2 histories at once. Richard bought the house on Fenwick Street. Not to replace Dorothy or claim anything, but because Dorothy's hip had been getting worse and the damp in the walls wasn't helping, and because the steps he'd fixed in February were only the beginning of a longer list, and because having somewhere specific to come on Wednesdays and Sundays suited better than he'd expected. He didn't move in. He came over and fixed things and ate dinner and helped Owen with the kind of math homework that had advanced beyond Dorothy's recollection, and gradually the rhythms of the house on Fenwick Street accommodated him the way old houses accommodate new habits, creaking a bit at first, then settling. Dorothy watched all of this with her characteristic manner of feeling more than she said, which Owen had inherited or learned, or possibly both. One evening in May, with the window finally free of the stuffed dish towel and the kitchen smelling of the soup Dorothy made every Thursday, and the radiator quiet for once in the mild spring air, Owen sat at the kitchen table, doing homework, and Richard sat across from him, reading something on his phone, and Dorothy stood at the stove with her back to both of them, stirring, and the three of them were simply there together. Not performing anything, not resolving anything, just present in the ordinary, unremarkable way of people who have found their way to the same place. Owen looked up from his textbook and glanced at Richard. Richard looked up from his phone. "Leafs are in the playoffs," Owen said. Richard said, "I know, I got tickets," Dorothy said, without turning around. "I want a good seat this time." Neither of them had known she was paying attention, but that had always been Dorothy's way. Steadily, quietly, and completely, she had always been paying attention.